CEO Celeste Lockwood fired Nolan Pierce in front of the entire executive board, forcing him to set his badge on the conference table and walk out of the aviation company he had served for 15 years. 3 days later, at the reading of billionaire Everett Lockwood's will, the entire family went silent when the attorney announced that the man who controlled Lockwood Aviation was not a blood heir, but Nolan, the single father they had just humiliated. Everett did not only leave him a company worth $10 billion. He left him a secret powerful enough to destroy the Lockwood family entirely. Stay until the end to find out why Everett handed his aviation empire to someone outside the family bloodline. The announcement of Project Horizon had been building inside Lockwood Aviation for nearly 8 months. And by the time the acquisition papers were drafted, everyone on the executive floor treated the deal as finished business. 36 used passenger aircraft, $2.1 billion, and a timeline so tight that the company's legal team had already booked celebration dinners before the ink was dry. Nolan Pierce had spent 11 days reviewing the maintenance records attached to those aircraft, and what he found did not look like a routine purchase. It looked like a liability disguised in paperwork. Several of the planes carried maintenance logs that had been digitally duplicated, identical service entries appearing across different tail numbers on the same dates, a statistical impossibility, unless someone had copied the records rather than performed the work. Beyond the documentation problems, at least 4 aircraft showed structural corrosion patterns that no independent inspector had flagged, because no independent inspector had been allowed near them. Nolan submitted a formal request to pause the acquisition pending a third-party safety audit, attached his supporting data, and waited for a response that never came through official channels. Instead, what came back was a report bearing his own name, one he had never written, suggesting he had altered the technical data after being passed over for a senior promotion the previous year. Grant Lockwood, the company's chief financial officer and nephew of the founder, had presented the document to Celeste with the quiet efficiency of someone who had prepared it long before the dispute arose, and he had added a suggestion that Nolan might be coordinating with a competing carrier to drive down Lockwood's stock price ahead of the deal closing. Celeste reviewed both files over a single evening and arrived at the hangar the next morning with the kind of composure that came not from indifference, but from having already made a decision she did not enjoy. She gave Nolan a direct opportunity to retract his objections, to sign the safety confirmation and allow the acquisition to proceed, and the offer was not delivered cruelly. It was delivered as a pragmatic exit from a situation that had grown larger than either of them intended. $300 million in deposits had already been wired. The lending banks had commitments tied to the closing date. The board was watching. Nolan listened to everything she said and then declined calmly, without raising his voice or producing counter-arguments she had not already heard. He would not sign a document confirming that aircraft with falsified maintenance records were airworthy. In front of the assembled executive team in the main hangar, with the fuselage of a wide-body aircraft looming behind them like a steel witness, Celeste terminated his employment for breach of trust and conduct damaging to the company's financial interests. Nolan set his badge on the metal table without ceremony and said only that one day she would understand he had not been trying to stop the deal. He had been trying to stop those planes from flying. He drove home in the late afternoon light, picked up dinner for his daughter Maya without mentioning what had happened, and spent the evening looking at 15 years of employment history reduced to a cardboard box on the kitchen counter. Maya was 19 and perceptive enough to recognize that her father had not simply had a difficult day, but she did not press him, because she had grown up watching Nolan keep hard things close until he had decided what to do with them. He had raised her through her mother's illness and death on the same principle he applied to maintenance data. Understand the full picture before acting, and never let urgency substitute for accuracy. Everett Lockwood, who had watched the entire proceeding from the observation deck above the hangar floor, said nothing and did not intervene. He died 4 days later. The following morning, Nolan received a certified letter requiring his presence at the Lockwood estate for the formal reading of the estate documents, a letter that addressed him by name despite the fact that he had never met Everett personally and had no connection to the family outside of his terminated employment contract. The Lockwood estate sat on 40 acres north of the city, and on the morning of the reading the driveway held enough imported vehicles to suggest that every member of the family had arrived expecting something specific. Victor Lockwood, the founder's eldest son chairman of the board, had spent the previous 3 days in conversations with the family's legal team that confirmed, at least in his understanding, that he would assume majority voting control of the parent company. Grant had told his own attorneys to prepare documentation for a CEO transition, expecting that Celeste's position would become formalized under his father's oversight, with himself elevated shortly after. Celeste had not consulted attorneys about the inheritance at all. She wanted to know whether her grandfather had left guidance about the airline's strategic direction, not about money. She had built the carrier's operational efficiency over 6 years and had no interest in the company's financial structure beyond its ability to function. Nolan arrived in a charcoal suit that fit well but had not been pressed recently, and he was met at the entrance by an assistant who directed him to a chair at the back of the formal sitting room, away from the family cluster near the fireplace. The glances he received from Victor and Grant contained the particular combination of contempt and confusion that people produce when they cannot decide whether an intrusion is intentional or merely oblivious. Reese Callahan, the estate attorney, who had managed Everett's affairs for over a decade, delivered the document summary with the detachment of someone reading a weather report. Everett had distributed the majority of his personal assets conventionally: property, cash holdings, art, and private vehicles, among family members in proportions that produced polite relief around the room. Then Reese stated that Everett had, 6 months prior to his death, transferred his full 51% voting interest in Lockwood Aviation Group into an irrevocable trust designated Pierce Aviation Trust, with Nolan Pierce named as the sole beneficiary and sole trustee. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the sound of a car on the gravel outside became briefly audible. Victor stood up before Reese finished the sentence. Grant reached for his phone. Celeste did not move, but her expression shifted from composed grief to something that looked less like shock and more like the recalculation of a problem she had believed was already solved. Nolan held still, because the information Reese had just delivered meant that the company he had been escorted out of 72 hours earlier was now, as a matter of legal record, his. Victor accused Nolan of manipulating an elderly man in declining health. Grant demanded the trust be voided on grounds of undue influence. Celeste said nothing to Nolan directly, but looked at him with the assessment of someone deciding whether the coincidence of his dismissal and his inheritance was, in fact, a coincidence. Everett had also recorded a short video, which played on the room's main screen without introduction. In it, the founder appeared thinner than his public photographs, but composed, and he said plainly that if the family was watching this recording, it meant they had fired the only person left who still remembered that airplanes existed to carry people, not to carry greed. He had given Nolan 180 days to keep Lockwood Aviation independent, complete a safety audit, and prevent the company from being absorbed by a competitor. If Nolan failed or chose not to act, the trust's shares would be liquidated and the proceeds directed to an aviation scholarship fund. As attendees dispersed, Reese handed Nolan a sealed envelope. Inside was a single handwritten line from Everett: "Do not trust anyone in this family, including Celeste." Victor filed for a court injunction to freeze the trust within 48 hours, and while the motion worked through the legal system, Nolan retained voting rights under judicial supervision that required him to document every decision he made. The board convened expecting him to appear at the company's headquarters with attorneys and a list of terminations, beginning with Celeste. What he did instead surprised everyone in the room and frustrated several of them. He confirmed Celeste's position as CEO and offered 3 reasons for the decision, each delivered without visible emotion. She understood the airline's operational mechanics better than any replacement the board could identify. Removing a chief executive during an active financial crisis would trigger credit covenant violations with the lending banks, and Everett's letter had noted that the person who signed the termination order was not necessarily the person who created the false narrative behind it. Celeste accepted the confirmation with the stiffness of someone who understood the logic, but had not asked to be retained by the man she had dismissed. Nolan also issued an instruction to suspend Project Horizon pending independent review, which required him to exercise the voting control that Victor's injunction was attempting to block, and the resulting paperwork produced a week of legal activity that consumed both the company's internal counsel and 3 outside firms. Celeste objected formally to the suspension, citing the $300 million deposit already placed, and the reputational damage of backing away from a signed acquisition framework. Nolan took her into the hangar and showed her the raw maintenance data on a tablet, the original files, not the version that had been submitted to the board, and pointed to the entries that appeared across multiple tail numbers in identical format. She examined the records for nearly 20 minutes without speaking, and then asked him where the original files had been stored. He told her they had been on the company server until someone with elevated access privileges had replaced them approximately 3 weeks before his termination. Celeste did not say Grant's name aloud, but something shifted in her posture that suggested she had begun running a different calculation than the one she had been using. She did not trust Nolan, not entirely, but she had stopped being certain she could trust the version of events she had been given. Victor, meanwhile, was meeting privately with minority shareholders and presenting a portrait of Nolan as a capable technician who had stumbled into ownership without the experience or temperament required to manage an international carrier. He circulated a brief to each institutional holder outlining Nolan's salary history, his lack of executive credentials, and the absence of any board-level appointment in his professional background. The clear implication being that Everett had made a sentimental decision in his final months that the adults in the room were now obligated to correct. The brief was well-written, factually accurate in its narrow selection of details, and completely silent on the maintenance data, the Summit Aerolease payments, and the altered files that had produced the termination in the first place. His first unilateral action reinforced the argument. Nolan canceled the fleet of 7 private aircraft maintained for family and executive use, effective immediately, while explicitly preserving full wages and benefits for every frontline employee at every station the company operated. The financial review that Nolan and Celeste conducted jointly over the following 2 weeks produced results that neither of them had fully anticipated. Lockwood Aviation's balance sheet, as presented to the board, showed a company under pressure but fundamentally solvent. The actual structure, traced through subsidiaries and lease agreements, revealed something different. Dozens of aircraft that appeared on the company's operational fleet were not owned by Lockwood Aviation. They had been sold to an entity called Summit Aerolease and then leased back at rates that exceeded fair market value by margins ranging from 20 to 35%. Summit Aerolease was controlled through a series of holding companies in 2 states, and the beneficial owners of those holding companies, once the corporate layers were removed, included trusts associated with Victor Lockwood and accounts connected to Grant. Every month, tens of millions of dollars that should have remained inside Lockwood Aviation as operational cash were leaving the company through lease payments and advisory fees routed to entities the family controlled. The total extraction over 4 years amounted to a hidden liability of approximately $2.4 billion. Money that explained why the airline, which had carried strong passenger numbers, consistently struggled to generate the free cash flow its revenue suggested it should produce. Celeste sat with the spreadsheet open in front of her for a long time before she said anything, and when she did speak, it was to note that she had signed several of the lease renewals without understanding what she was approving. She had been given summaries, not source documents, and Grant had been the person managing the relationship with Summit. Nolan did not point out that this was consistent with everything he had been telling her since the reading of the will. He produced instead a restructuring framework he called Northstar, which addressed the company's immediate liquidity problem through a combination of route suspensions on the carrier's least profitable legacy corridors, an expansion of overnight cargo operations on routes currently running below capacity, renegotiation of airport facility agreements, and the sale of luxury real estate assets the company owned that had no connection to airline operations. The plan did not include workforce reductions. Celeste acknowledged that the framework was operationally coherent, but pointed out that executing it required bank financing that would not be available as long as Damien Ashcroft's acquisition offer was sitting on the table. Ashcroft Global Air had submitted a formal bid of $8.7 billion for the entire company, a number low enough to concern serious analysts, but high enough to eliminate the debt and preserve personal fortunes for everyone in the founding family. Victor wanted to accept it immediately, and he had the minority shareholder relationships to make acceptance feel inevitable. Grant produced documents released to financial media claiming that Caleb Pierce, Nolan's father, had received millions of dollars from Everett years before his death, framing the payment as evidence that Nolan had financial motives predating the inheritance and had been working toward the company's acquisition since before Everett's decline. Nolan had grown up knowing his father as a meticulous, quiet man who had spent his career in aviation engineering and died in a test flight accident when Nolan was 16. He had understood the settlement his mother received as compensation from an insurance claim. What Everett's files revealed was a different history entirely. Caleb Pierce had not been merely an employee of the early Lockwood operation. He had contributed capital, developed the operational routing model that allowed the young carrier to survive its first 3 unprofitable years, and held a formal equity stake of 25% that had been negotiated and documented before the company had a single revenue flight. He had been, in every practical sense, a co-founder. Approximately 27 years before the will reading, Caleb had reviewed a prototype aircraft that Everett intended to use for a demonstration flight timed to coincide with a critical investor meeting. Caleb had concluded the aircraft was not ready. Stress fractures in a secondary support assembly had not been properly assessed, and he had put his objection in writing. Everett had overridden the caution and proceeded with the flight to avoid losing the investment commitment. Caleb had died when the aircraft experienced a structural failure at altitude. In the months that followed, Everett had purchased Caleb's equity stake from his widow at a fraction of its value, before the company's subsequent growth made that stake worth tens of millions of dollars, and had structured the transaction to look like a routine buyout rather than what it actually was. The acquisition of a dead partner's share from a grieving woman who did not have lawyers reviewing the documents. The money Grant had surfaced was not a bribe. It was Everett's later, private attempt to send financial support to Caleb's family through intermediaries, an act that had no legal effect on the original injustice, and that Everett had never disclosed publicly or explained to his own family. Victor used the revelation to argue in shareholder communications that Nolan had been maneuvering toward the company since childhood, motivated by a grievance he had inherited along with his surname. Celeste found Everett's private journal in the estate archive and read, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, a sentence that had apparently been written and rewritten over many years. He had built Lockwood Aviation on Caleb's vision and his own silence. She brought the journal to Nolan in silence and waited while he read the relevant pages. He read them twice and then set the journal down and looked at the wall for a while. Maya had visited her father the previous weekend and told him plainly that Everett could not return the years that had been taken by handing over a corporation, and that the question worth answering was not whether Nolan wanted to own Lockwood Aviation, but whether he wanted to make it what Father Farid believed it could become. A maintenance technician working overtime that same week discovered that one of the Project Horizon aircraft, a wide body that had been flagged in Nolan's original review, had been quietly added to the test flight schedule by an authorization code registered to Grant's credentials, despite Nolan's formal suspension order still being in effect. Grant's stated purpose was to demonstrate that Nolan had exaggerated the safety concerns to manufacture a pretext for blocking the acquisition. He had arranged for a test flight with several institutional investors and 2 aviation journalists as observers, timed to occur on a morning when the court injunction on Nolan's voting rights was still partially active. Celeste discovered the flight on the operational schedule with less than 2 hours remaining before the planned departure time. Nolan did not attempt to physically stop the aircraft or confront Grant at the gate. He contacted the company's legal team, invoked his authority as the controlling trustee, which the court had not fully suspended, and filed an emergency maintenance hold request with the Regional Air Traffic Control Authority, citing unresolved technical discrepancies in the aircraft's pressure warning system documentation. The hold request required a federal safety inspector to physically clear the aircraft before departure clearance could be issued. Grant told the assembled investors and journalists that Nolan was manufacturing a public relations crisis to embarrass the company and damage the acquisition timeline. The federal inspector arrived within 90 minutes, reviewed the aircraft's maintenance log against the original manufacturer service records, and identified a fatigue crack in a primary load-bearing structural component that had not appeared in any of the documentation Grant's team had submitted. The crack was not catastrophic in isolation, but on a long-haul route under pressurization cycling, it represented a failure risk that no reputable carrier would accept. The flight was grounded. Celeste spent the following 3 hours in a conference room with the original maintenance files, cross-referencing the data Nolan had flagged with the audit trail of who had accessed and modified each record. The modification timestamps on the documents that had been used to terminate Nolan led to a workstation registered to Grant Lockwood's executive credentials. She called Grant directly and gave him the opportunity to explain. His explanation was not persuasive. Celeste issued a formal suspension of Grant from his CFO duties pending investigation, a decision she made unilaterally and documented through the company's legal counsel before informing Victor. When Nolan later told her that her apology was accepted but that he needed her to understand something, she waited. He said she had not created the false report, but she had fired him because she trusted a family name more than a documented fact, and that was a different kind of failure from forgery, but it was still a failure worth naming. She did not argue. Victor responded to Grant's suspension by announcing a special board session with an accelerated vote to remove Celeste as CEO and to seek judicial relief blocking Nolan from any further exercise of trustee authority. Grant informed both of them separately that he had secured enough proxy commitments to remove them both from meaningful governance within 48 hours. Victor's pitch to the shareholder base was constructed around a coherent narrative. Two individuals with personal grievances against the founding family had converted an inheritance dispute into an operational war that was destroying the company's market value and pushing its best acquisition opportunity toward expiration. Damien Ashcroft formalized his offer with additional commitments: full debt retirement, retention of the Lockwood brand for a minimum of 2 years, and employment guarantees for all current staff extending 6 months post-closing. The numbers were real enough to move people, and within the institutional investor community, several funds that had previously been neutral began signaling support for the sale. Nolan understood that the vote arithmetic, without intervention, would produce an outcome before the court could restore his full trustee rights. The variable he focused on was the employee pension fund, which held 8% of the company's outstanding shares and had been managed independently of family influence for nearly a decade. The fund's governance board was chaired by a former aircraft mechanic named Douglas Webb, who had spent 31 years with the carrier and was not interested in being told what decision was obvious. Nolan met with Douglas and 3 other fund representatives for 2 hours in a conference room at a hotel 2 miles from the company's headquarters. He presented the North Star framework in full detail, explained the Summit Aerolease extraction, and outlined what Ashcroft's acquisition structure would actually produce: a leveraged buyout financed against the company's own assets, which would require asset sales within 18 months to service the acquisition debt, and those asset sales would be the aircraft and the route certificates that made Lockwood Aviation worth anything to its employees. He then offered the pension fund something no controlling shareholder had ever offered them: a formal seat on the Operational Oversight Committee and a commitment to transfer 10% of the trust's equity into a permanent employee ownership structure if the company navigated the crisis without a forced sale. Douglas told Nolan he would need to review the North Star projections with the fund's financial advisors, and that he was not in the business of taking someone's word for numbers. He also said that in 31 years, he had watched 3 different management regimes promise the workforce that their interests were the company's priority, and that each time the promise had dissolved the moment a larger financial pressure appeared, and he wanted to know why this time was different. Nolan told him it was different because this time the person making the promise was putting his own equity behind it, and because the restructuring documents were written in a way that gave the employee representatives actual authority to block decisions that violated the terms, not merely the right to be consulted before the decision was announced. Douglas looked at him for a moment and said that was either the most honest answer he had ever heard from a company owner or the most sophisticated piece of persuasion, and that he genuinely could not yet tell which. Celeste had spent the same afternoon assembling the evidence trail connecting Victor and Grant to Summit and to the preliminary agreement they had signed with Ashcroft's acquisition team, a document that included a private indemnification clause releasing both men from any liability related to the lease transactions in exchange for facilitating the sale. She brought the full package to Nolan late that evening and told him it was his to use. He asked if she understood that using it would likely result in criminal referrals for both her uncle and her cousin. She said she had considered that, and that the people who serviced those aircraft and the people who boarded them had not been consulted about whether they wanted to be sold, and she had decided that protecting the family name was not worth what it would cost everyone else. The relationship between them had changed, though neither named it directly. The court issued a supplementary notice the following morning. An attorney representing Victor had filed a second will document that, if authenticated, would reverse the entire inheritance structure. The second will was professionally produced, notarized, witnessed, formatted correctly, and dated in a period when Everett had been in reasonably good health. It designated Victor as the primary voting interest holder and reduced Nolan's bequest to a cash payment of $200,000. Reese Callahan reviewed it within the hour and stated under oath that she had never seen the document, had not prepared it, and that the notary seal on the signature page belonged to a public notary who had worked 2 years prior as a document specialist for Summit Aerolease's registered agent. With the second will before the court, the judge issued a temporary stay on all of Nolan's trustee actions pending authentication review, and Victor assumed interim operational authority, reinstating Grant to his CFO position the same afternoon. Celeste was given 48 hours to vacate her executive office and was told she could retain her personal inheritance if she issued a public statement confirming that Nolan had manipulated Everett's decision-making during the final months of his life. She declined. She walked out of the company's headquarters building alone, without her security detail or her assistant, and Nolan was waiting outside in his truck. The two of them worked for the next 36 hours from a rented conference space, reconstructing the timeline of the second will's execution. The document's metadata showed a creation date that aligned with a period Everett had been traveling. Specifically, the notarization was dated to a Wednesday afternoon on which Everett, according to his own calendar, had been participating in a video conference from a hotel in another state. Victor's legal team had anticipated this objection and produced flight records from the family's private aviation coordinator showing the founder's aircraft had been at the local executive terminal that day, suggesting he could have been present for the signing. Nolan pulled the fuel delivery records for the aircraft and the hangar security camera logs from the terminal's facilities manager, who produced them after a formal records request. The aircraft had not moved. Its fuel load was identical on Tuesday evening and Thursday morning, and the camera showed the plane sitting undisturbed in the hangar throughout Wednesday. Everett could not have been at the notary's office because his aircraft never left the ground. Reese also identified that the notary seal used on the second will had been reported as lost and formally decommissioned 3 years before the will's alleged execution date, a discrepancy that, once submitted to the court's document examiner, produced a written finding of likely forgery within hours. Victor, informed that the authentication review was moving against him, instructed the company secretary to schedule an emergency shareholder meeting for the following morning, 24 hours earlier than the standard notice period, with a single agenda item: approval of the Ashcroft acquisition at the revised price of $12 billion. $12 billion was not a number that lacked effect. It was above the company's current market capitalization, above the valuations produced by any of the 3 investment banks that had run models on the carrier in the past year, and large enough that several institutional shareholders who had been neutral began quietly inquiring about the logistics of a yes vote. Even members of the Employee Pension Fund's governance board, who had reviewed the North Star projections with genuine interest, were receiving calls from members asking whether the certainty of a $12 billion sale was preferable to the uncertainty of a turnaround plan managed by a man who had never run a corporation. Nolan traced the acquisition's financing structure through the offering memorandum Ashcroft's team had distributed and found the mechanism within 40 minutes of having the document in front of him. The $12 billion was not cash. Approximately $7.4 billion of it was a leveraged credit facility collateralized by Lockwood Aviation's aircraft fleet, its gate leases, and its international route certificates, the core operating assets of the airline itself. Ashcroft's team would use the company's own infrastructure as security for the debt required to purchase it. And servicing that debt at the rates specified in the memorandum would require asset disposals beginning within 14 months of closing. He presented this to the pension fund board that evening with a single question. If Ashcroft sold the aircraft to service the acquisition debt and surrendered the route certificates to reduce the liability, what did the 6-month employment guarantee actually protect? Douglas Webb asked how certain North Star's cash generation projections were. Nolan said they were projections, not guarantees, and that he was willing to pledge his entire inherited equity stake as collateral for the restructuring financing, which meant that if the plan failed, he personally lost everything Everett had given him. Douglas looked at the financial models for a while, and then looked at Nolan. Celeste, appearing before a different group of investors that same evening, presented the complete Summit Aero Lease documentation and the preliminary agreement Victor and Grant had signed with Ashcroft's team, including the personal indemnification clause. She stated that she was accepting the likely consequences to her own inheritance and family relationships, because the alternative was explaining to 15,000 employees that their jobs had been sold to retire a debt that existed because 2 family members had been quietly extracting the company's cash for 4 years. Nolan was asked by a reporter following a brief public statement whether he believed he had any moral authority over the company, given that his claim derived from a billionaire's private decision rather than any elected or merit-based process. He answered that he did not know whether he had moral authority, but he knew that the $12 billion offer would dissolve Lockwood Aviation within 2 years, and that the people who would lose the most had not been asked. Grant released an audio recording the following morning, hours before the shareholder meeting, in which a voice identified as Nolan said that one day this company would return to the person it truly belonged to. The recording was clean and the voice was clearly Nolan's. Grant presented it as evidence of a long-running scheme, that Nolan had cultivated Everett's trust over years, manipulated the old man's guilt about Caleb, orchestrated the Project Horizon dispute to manufacture a dramatic public moment, and positioned himself as the wronged party in order to receive an inheritance he had engineered rather than earned. It was a credible narrative if the listener did not know its context, and Grant had made sure it reached every board member and major shareholder before the meeting convened. Nolan, asked to respond at the meeting's opening, did not contest the recording's authenticity. He explained that it was a conversation he had recorded with his father when Nolan was 14 years old, and Caleb was explaining why he had stayed with Everett's company despite a contractual dispute that had never been fully resolved, and that the line about the company returning to the right person referred to Caleb's belief that equity built on honest work eventually finds honest hands. He then stated that he intended to release the complete archive of Everett's personal records, every document Reese had transmitted to him as part of the estate package, including the account of Caleb's death, the equity buyout, and Everett's private journals. He said this would reduce Lockwood Aviation's valuation, likely significantly, because markets do not reward the disclosure of a founder's misconduct regardless of how long ago it occurred. He said he understood that and was proceeding anyway, because Everett had written that he had built Lockwood Aviation on Caleb's vision and his own silence, and Nolan had no interest in maintaining the silence on behalf of a man who was no longer alive to carry its weight. Celeste followed with a structured presentation of the Grant forgery evidence, the Summit Aero Lease cash extraction documentation, and the financial analysis showing that the company's distress had been manufactured rather than organic. Reese submitted the court's formal authentication finding via electronic filing to the meeting's legal observer, and the judge's order restoring Nolan's full trustee authority arrived in the room's legal inbox, while Victor was still attempting to procedurally delay the agenda. Nolan cast his 51% voting interest in 4 consecutive resolutions: rejection of the Ashcroft acquisition offer, removal of Victor and Grant Lockwood from the board of directors effective immediately, authorization of an independent forensic audit of all Summit Aerolease transactions, and appointment of Celeste Lockwood as acting chief executive pending a formal board election within 90 days. Victor told the room that everything he had done was to keep the company within the family and to protect what his father had built. Grant said nothing and directed his anger toward his father. Nolan replied to Victor that he had never protected the family. He had protected his own position within it, which was a different thing entirely, and the board had just voted on which version of the company's future it preferred. The authorities who received the forensic referral arrived to seal the financial records that afternoon. Victor and Grant retained separate criminal attorneys by evening. 1 year after the shareholder meeting, Lockwood Aviation had withdrawn from Project Horizon, with partial deposit recovery secured through arbitration after the acquisition target's maintenance fraud was formally documented. The North Star restructuring had moved the carrier from operational loss to modest profitability across 3 consecutive quarters without a single involuntary layoff. The Summit Aerolease litigation had produced a preliminary settlement recovering $680 million, with additional claims pending. Douglas Webb told an aviation trade publication that the employee ownership structure was the first governance arrangement in his 3 decades at the company that had been written by someone who appeared to understand the difference between giving workers a voice and giving them power, and that he intended to hold Nolan to every line of it. Nolan had restructured the company's ownership in ways that no one in the Lockwood family would have approved, and that Everett, in his later years, had apparently hoped someone would eventually have the authority to implement. 10% of the trust's equity had been transferred into permanent employee ownership, administered through a governance board that included elected representatives from the mechanic and cabin crew unions. All board-level safety determinations were assigned a veto function independent of executive authority. Any certified safety officer could ground an aircraft without approval from finance or operations. Whistleblower protections for personnel reporting. Airworthiness concerns were codified into the employment agreement rather than addressed through voluntary policy. Pierce Aviation Trust retained controlling interest but was subject to annual transparency reporting made publicly available on the company's investor relations page. Nolan did not become chief executive. He held the title of board chairman with a defined mandate covering strategic oversight and safety governance, and he ran that function the way he had run his previous role, by reading data carefully and saying what he found. The board elected Celeste as chief executive through a merit evaluation process that her own lawyers confirmed was procedurally independent of family influence, and she accepted the position with a public acknowledgement that she had terminated a safety officer on the basis of fabricated evidence, and that the governance reforms she was implementing were designed specifically to prevent the chain of authority that had allowed that decision to stand. Victor and Grant faced separate indictment proceedings on charges that included securities fraud, forgery of a testamentary document, and breach of fiduciary duty. The Caleb Pierce Aviation Institute opened its training facility at the company's main maintenance base, funded by a scholarship endowment Nolan had established from a portion of the estate cash he received. He had not named a building or commissioned a portrait. He had created a program for young engineers who could not otherwise afford the certification costs to enter commercial aviation maintenance, and he had named it in a way that said plainly what it was for. Maya attended the opening ceremony and stood next to her father while someone else gave the speech, which was how both of them preferred it. The closing scene took place in the main hangar, the same structure where Celeste had called the executive staff to witness Nolan's termination, where the metal table had held his badge for the few seconds between when he set it down and when he walked out into an afternoon that had felt, at the time, like a permanent ending. Celeste met him there on a Thursday morning and handed him the badge, which she had kept in her desk drawer for 12 months without being entirely sure why, whether out of guilt or habit or the less comfortable possibility that she had always understood, somewhere beneath the decision she had made in that hangar, that she might eventually need to give it back. He looked at it for a moment, turned it over in his hand, and said he no longer needed it, since no one could fire him now. She smiled and asked what she was supposed to do when the board chairman refused to listen to the chief executive. He said she should invite him to coffee instead of calling the board into session. She asked him to dinner. He said yes, but that they were going to begin as two people, not as an owner and a chief executive, and they walked out of the hangar together into the gray morning light. Everett had left Nolan a company worth $10 billion, but the inheritance that finally settled the debt between two families was not the equity or the title or the control. It was the open door through which a man who had once been escorted out of that same building now decided, for himself, who else would be allowed to walk through it.
I think last was really good.
Focus and disperse.
We got another spark.
Oceans traversed.
I'll fucking take it,
You
bro.
still have a lot to learn. But give yourself time.
Yeah. I'll take a few more sparks. Please. Yeah, you defeated him. We got his ass. We beat his ass. Let's get it. Five minutos. At the temple, you have to fight him again, but he's a bear. Okay. That's straight.